Dr. PK. I'm a professor and a social scientist of culture, and today I'm going to answer, how does gaslighting work? In the last video, I said that no gaslighter is an island, meaning that although gaslighting is a psychological form of manipulation and is a psychological phenomenon, it is an inherently social practice. And if we really want to understand how and why gaslighting works, we need to shift our focus from the gaslighter and the gaslightee to the social context and social conditions that makes gaslighting possible in the first place. And this is precisely the argument of Professor Paige L. Sweet in her article, The Sociology of Gaslighting, where she gives us a framework for doing exactly this. The framework comes in two layers. First is the micro context, which emphasizes face-to-face interactions. Now, Sweet says that gaslighting works when it is deployed in unequal and intimate relationships. The second layer is where we find broader social resources and institutions, including stereotypes and structural inequalities, raw materials of gaslighting. With this, we're going to outline what has to be in place for gaslighters' simple tactics to have such a complicated and devastating effect. First, at the micro level, we have intimate relationships. And here, an intimate relationship doesn't refer only to a romantic one, it really just refers to any ongoing relationship where you're invested and you can't easily leave without risking something that is important to you. You could be risking something like romance, or maybe a more general sense of social or emotional support, as with relationships with friends or relatives. Other examples could include a boss and an employee, where leaving you might be risking employment or financial security, a doctor and a patient, risking healthcare access, or even educational opportunities. Sweet herself uses the example of a relationship between a graduate student and a professor. What makes a relationship intimate is that the other person is meaningfully embedded in your life. You can't just dismiss whatever they say to you because you have a stake in making that relationship work. Sweet also notes that gaslighting is effectively accomplished in intimate relationships where there's unequal power. In sociology, when we talk about power, we're often referring to the ability to get someone to do something even if they prefer not to or actively resist. And power can come in many forms. There's financial power, so it could be physical power, it could be social power, influence or status, or some other form of authority. Point of privilege, I want to nerd out on the idea of credibility a little bit because it's highly relevant for understanding social power, and it's also something that I study. Okay, so credibility is ultimately about whom gets believed, whose claims and accounts are taken as true and trustworthy. So, when we talk about a credible witness, for instance, we mean someone whose testimony can be treated as reliable. It is a relational quality, meaning that it's something that we convey in interactions and communication, and then others assess and judge and deem us credible or not. So, why this type of assessment or evaluation is so interesting is because judgments of credibility are not as closely tied to assessing the content and accuracy of what people are saying as one might logically expect. Instead, it's often tied up with judgments of social position. For example, Stephen Shapin is a historian of science, and he explained that people who were part of the elite were often seen as more credible than others. Why was this the case? Well, the assumption was made that if you were elite and if you had lots of money and success, then you really didn't have any incentive for lying because you had what you needed. You had enough. Therefore, your stories, your accounts, your word would be judged as more credible than, say, someone who was poor or working. It's not simply that power makes you seem more believable, but that being believable, being thought of as more credible, is often part of what social power is. Now, let's jump from the 17th century to today and think about credibility online. So, I know that what I'm saying is reliable, reasonably accurate, and trustworthy because I know that I've painstakingly combed over peer-reviewed studies to prepare for these videos. I know that I'm trained to understand the data and the arguments that are made in these studies, and I am also serving as an editor-in-chief of a scientific journal, meaning that people in my subfield trust my expertise and my judgment, and I've earned a lot of credibility in my professional life. But here, I don't know. There are for sure lots of other creators with as much credibility as me without anywhere near similar credentials. And that's not a dig because maybe their credibility comes from the fact that they have a much larger audience. Maybe they've been on the platform for long.
Maybe they have gray hair and no history. Huh?
Or maybe they work with the whole team and their lips are always matching what they say. It's just another example of how credibility is determined through social judgment and perception rather than simply vetting the actual content of what people are saying. Credibility matters because gaslighting requires not only getting someone to doubt their own reality, but other people and other institutions will doubt them too. Let's talk about the second layer of Sweet's framework. Gaslighting is effective precisely because the lies, the denials, the obfuscations all draw from real cultural beliefs and real inequalities operating at the macro and meso levels. Let's look at some examples to make this really concrete. Gender scripts. So, one of the most common gaslighting strategies is to associate a person's reaction or perception with irrationality, either by calling that person crazy or convincing them and the people around them that they're just overreacting, being dramatic, or are legitimately unstable. Crazy is a highly feminized term. That doesn't mean that it only gets used on women. You can absolutely accuse a man or male bodied person of being dramatic, being a drama queen. The reason that it works as an insult is usually about the person being likened to a woman. That's why it cuts. I mean, it's all over pop culture. Look at the actual words we use.
Good night, ladies.
Good night. I was gonna say you throw like a girl, but I throw way harder than you.
Tell your pal stop being a pussy and start growing a pair.
What do you get, your period?
If calling a man crazy or emotional stings, it's precisely because of the stigmatization and degradation of everything feminine. Why is craziness in particular so feminized? There are deep seated historical roots to this idea. The word hysteria, as in hysterical, comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera.
Hyster.
Ancient Greek medicine imagined the wandering womb theory. And the idea was that the uterus was like its own independent thing inside the body and could just kind of roam around freely and could cause illness and erratic behavior. So if people didn't know what was up with you, they might think, oh, her womb was probably wandering around and like knocked her in the noggin. The theory sounds completely absurd now. But the association of being erratic, illogical, and emotional being somehow imminent in the female body still survives to this day. And though the theory now sounds completely absurd, what I find the most absurd is that the legacy of the wandering womb theory, iterated by all these men, that women have unreasonable ideas or are irrational, and men to this day are still seen as more trustworthy and competent when it comes to women's health. Good one, patriarchy. The point is that when a gaslighter portrays someone as crazy, especially when it is a woman, they are not inventing a new idea from scratch. They are simply citing history. They're simply quoting culture. Other cultural beliefs, such as those connected to race, nationality, class, disability, sexuality, and other social categories, intersect with gendered scripts about irrationality. And all of these can be used to make the case that someone is an unreliable narrator or even the true aggressor. While the gaslighter may repeat stereotypes and beliefs, the target has likely encountered all of these meanings before because they circulate in our shared culture and we are primed to think of them through repetition and familiarity. So by the time the gaslighter brings up the idea that, say, a woman is overreacting to a situation, I mean, it may not even be the first time she heard that message that day. And also, like, let's be real. It's not as though the angry black woman trope or the hot-blooded Latino person stereotype are things that we're not all familiar with and we have not encountered before. As an Asian woman, I come up against the whole like subservient, passive stereotype. There was a period of time where when I would like just go outside anywhere, people would often assume that I worked for them. So, for instance, I've been asked to find products at Sephora for people. I've been asked to seat people in cafes, even though I was there like working on my dissertation. And even once at an art show, I was asked to take pictures of a couple that was there because they assumed I was working the event rather than just there as a spectator. Like, if you start from like expecting me to be passive and compliant, the fact that I, one, say anything, disagree, and then advocate for my position, then I'm difficult or I'm asking for too much. And we don't live in a perfect world. We have a ready made repository of shared cultural beliefs that paint people into a corner, especially when it comes to how the person should behave, is expected to behave in difficult and challenging situations. And all of these beliefs combine to make the work of the gaslighter that much easier. Gaslighting doesn't only rely on stereotypes and unfair perceptions to work. They also draw on the very real structural vulnerabilities and dangers that people confront. In Sweet's larger research with women in abusive relationships, which includes gaslighting, she notes that abusers would commonly leverage their cultural knowledge of how systems work. to make it appear that they had more power than they really did to get their target to comply. For instance, making claims like that they have the power to have you institutionalized, to use the fact that a person has used mental health services as evidence that the person is crazy, which is just another reason why it's incredibly important that we destigmatize seeking mental health support. Because underneath this idea, of course, is the cultural belief that only unstable or unwell people ever need to seek therapy or other mental health supports. The gaslighter doesn't need any of this to be true or to mobilize it and weaponize it in institutional processes. For instance, if someone shares a child, custody decisions do get made on assessments of a parent's stability. Or another tactic was to tell their partners that they were being watched or to say that ICE was patrolling their neighborhood. I don't have to expand for us to understand how that would make someone feel so unsafe. Now, it may not be true 100% of the time, 100% of the cases, but the threat has just enough truth to it. And that's what makes it all so hard to dismiss. The target has a complicated calculus of what part of the threat is real and what part of it is or distortion. What's true, what's been exaggerated, and in what proportion. What are the potential risks if they resist or if they dismiss something that was actually true. And of course, this is crazy making, or drawing on Kathleen Ferraro's term, the experience is surreal. Now, surreality is not the absence of reality. Surreality is when reality is made difficult to read, interpret, and parse. It's this blurriness and the inability to discriminate. That confusion isn't a side effect, it's the whole point. That is the mechanism of control. This is what Sweet means when she says that a sociological framework allows us to understand how abstract social inequalities at these higher levels of analysis, these macro and meso levels, get transformed into interpersonal weapons within an intimate and power-laden relationship. And the gaslighter doesn't need to be some kind of genius because they don't invent the stereotypes or the cultural beliefs. They have inherited them. They don't create these types of institutional inequalities or vulnerabilities. They simply distort them and use them to gain control. And it isn't just about being made to believe things that are not true. The gaslighter combines a very real vulnerability and inequality with manufactured information. The tactics used to gaslight are actually pretty basic: lying, denying things, changing details, or flipping the story. None of this is mental level CIA stuff. To give an explicit answer to the question that I opened with, how is it that such simple tactics can create such devastating results? Well, the answer is that because the tactics of gaslighting themselves are simple, but the social machinery that gives gaslighting its teeth, that is complicated. Those inequalities are enduring, and that is powerful. Cole's notes, TLDR, why can't people just walk away from a gaslighter? Because the relationship is often high stakes and binding. Why does a gaslighter's account carry more weight? Because power and credibility aren't evenly distributed in society. It's easier for someone with more social power to gaslight someone with less. And how do people come to question their own perception and sense of reality? How does their situation become so surreal? The person being gaslit is not foolish for taking these threats, risks, and even distortions seriously. You are not foolish if someone is feeding you these distortions and exaggerations and you take them seriously, because they are anchored in real structural vulnerabilities that would be foolish to just ignore. And that's why gaslighting works. So this is a total bummer. It's a total bummer, but it's real. And given how much we talk about gaslighting and how many videos there are about it, if there's an appetite and there's interest in learning about gaslighting, and clearly there is, then fine, let's talk about it. But let's talk about all of it, including the social structures that enable it. And if we decide that we don't want this to happen anymore, then we need a fuller and more honest conversation and picture of the conditions that enable it. I've filmed this video about 4 times, just because I was just so concerned about getting it right and speaking about things accurately and respectfully. And every time that I've done this filming, I've walked away just so sad. And it took me 4 reshoots to find it. The kind of like just the glimmer of a silver lining that I have found is to know that a lot of these social dynamics are highly impersonal, that it's not really about you, which after the heartache can be liberating. We'll get to that next time. Until then, stay safe, and stay curious.